Amnesty International says the European Union is complicit in the abuse of refugees in Libya. It says European governments ignore rights violations and violent tactics used by the Libyan Coast Guard. So, will this report help refugees? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. The Mediterranean refugee crisis, once the top story on every channel, has fallen out of the spotlight in recent months. And that may be because refugee and migrant deaths are down significantly. But Amnesty International says many refugees aren't actually better off. As migration routes to Europe close down, hundreds of thousands have been forced back into detention centres in Libya, where they're often facing physical and sexual abuse. Amnesty says the European Union hasn't just been aware of these abuses, but it's been complicit in them. We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first this report from ElJarh.
These images sparked outrage around the world. African migrants at risk of being sold at auction in Libya. The accusation of modern-day slavery triggered international concern and EU pledges to address the issue. But in a report by the human rights group Amnesty International, European governments are accused of not only being aware of these abuses, but also actively supporting Libyan authorities in stopping sea crossings and preventing refugees and migrants from leaving.
What we have in Libya is really a hellhole. It's hell on earth. It's a lawless country to start with, and refugees and migrants are treated like a commodity. We heard about the parent slave auction just a week or two ago, and here we are. So essentially, any migrant or refugee is pretty much criminalized.
Italy has been singled out for criticism. It's accused of leading EU efforts to fund Libyan detention camps, train Libyan coast guards to intercept ships carrying refugees and migrants, as well as encouraging Libyan tribes and armed groups to work as border guards. Amnesty also found those prevented from leaving Libya face arbitrary detention, torture, forced labor, extortion, and death at the hands of the authorities, traffickers, as well as armed groups.
No European government official can claim to be unaware of what the Libyan authorities are doing, the kind of torture, the kind of horrific suffering that people are facing inside Libya. So I think the approach of the European Union is, in order to protect their own borders, they are ready to push people back at any cost and not respect even the basic rights of human beings.
Libya is the main transit point for refugees and migrants trying to reach Europe by sea. Nearly 500,000 people have made the dangerous crossing across the Mediterranean over the past 3 years. According to the UN's migration agency, in that time, close to 10,000 people have died while attempting to make it to Europe. Following the provision of ships, training and funding from the EU and Italy to the Libyan Coast Guard, Amnesty found the number of arrivals to Italy fell by nearly 70% between July and November compared with the same period last year. The number of refugees who die at sea has also reduced. But it's not clear what future awaits the estimated 20,000 migrants and refugees now in overcrowded and unsanitary detention centers across Libya. ElJarh for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guest for this edition of Inside Story. In Tunis, on Skype, Mohamed, ElJarh, an analyst covering Libya and non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafik Hariri Centre for the Middle East. In London, Philip Luther, Middle East and North Africa Research and Advocacy Director at Amnesty International, and from the European Parliament in Strasbourg. Also on Skype, PIRI, a Dutch member of the European Parliament. Thank you all for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Philip Luther, let me just begin with you in London. You do represent Amnesty International. It's an explosive accusation to make at this moment in time. Why has Amnesty decided to come to this conclusion with the evidence that you've collated?
Well, Amnesty International has been researching the situation of refugees and migrants in Libya for years now. This latest report really tries to put the finger on the extent of the abuse inside Libya, and specifically inside detention centres that are run by the Libyan authorities. And what we find is that tens of thousands are held there in indefinite and arbitrary detention, and they're exposed to really quite horrendous abuses, torture, extortion, bonded labour, and that's why we're putting it out now.
And how do you equate that then to the EU being complicit? How are they involved?
The European Union, and it's Italy in particular, that has done most to pursue cooperation with Libya, particularly over the last year. Not only is it fully aware of these abuses, but it has taken a whole stream of measures in order to cooperate with the Libyan authorities to stop those seeking to cross the Mediterranean from doing so, and therefore forcing refugees and migrants back into detention centres where they are at the mercy of not only the Libyan authorities and the guards that control these detention centres, but also then a network of others, militias, traffickers and smugglers who are contributing to that abuse.
Let's go over to KATI PIRI in Strasbourg, listening intently to what Philip Luther had to say. How do you respond to that as a member of the European Parliament, then also as a representative of the Netherlands as well, a country that is very supportive of migration and the problems that individuals have had in their own respective nations where there has been civil strife?
Well, this afternoon we are actually debating with the EU's foreign policy chief exactly about what this show is about, is the situation in Libya and to which extent the EU is involved or can be called responsible for what's happening there. So it's very much on the mind of the European Parliament, you know, and I think it's not only Amnesty, but we saw also the CNN report. We had already stories from Doctors Without Borders. We speak to people arriving in Italy and telling us about the horrendous stories that are happening inside Libya. The facts, I think, are clear and well recognized. The question is here, to which extent is the EU capable of, you know, we are not the ones hosting those reception centers. We're trying to do training for the Coast Guard without a monitoring system. I think that's a very big problem here. But you can also not say the EU shouldn't do anything and let all the people drown or let all the people just cross to the European Union. So politically, it's not so easy to find a solution for this problem, which is respectful of the human rights of the migrants and the refugees in Libya.
Let me bring in Mohamed ElJarh here. It's very interesting, isn't it? You have a scenario, and if I can just generally say, you know, Libya as a failed state in the sense that we've seen civil war and strife in the country with no real functioning government that controls the whole area. You've got the EU on the outside of those borders trying to protect itself, but also trying to finance agencies within Libya that can try and control the migration problem. And there the grey area is. They don't want to be involved in the internal affairs of a foreign country. That's the first thing that any of the 28-member bloc would say.
I mean, from within Libya, the way you would see this is that the European Union or the Italian government in this case is trying to delegate the task of stopping migrant or making sure that we bring the numbers of migrants crossing the sea down to a Libyan government that really does not exist on the ground. Because what we have is a Libyan government that cannot provide for its own citizens in Libya, where you have 1.3 million Libyans at the moment, according to the United Nations, in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. And you are giving the task of intercepting and detaining those migrants to a government that is overrun by militias, a government that is controlled by militias, and a government that contracted militias that are complicit in some cases in the abuses that we are talking about today.
How do you then deal with the scenario where Salil Shetty, who is the Amnesty International Secretary General, Mohamed, says here on Al Jazeera that even like the UNHCR has no access, as you just mentioned there, and that they would like to go in and do more research? You can't do that in a situation that is so unstable.
You definitely cannot do that because UNHCR staff or personnel would need to have security. Who will provide that security? If we can't provide security for UNHCR or IOM or any international organization to work, then there you go. Part of the problem is solved, that we do have security in Libya. The problem is that it's very difficult to achieve the security requirement for any international organization to operate. And I think I think that there is a little bit of a misunderstanding of the issue at hand here, because we need to look back at the root causes, the migrants. Where do they come from, and why do they make this journey? And many of them are not actually very poor compared to the standards of those that are left behind in the countries of origin. These are people who have phones, who have enough money to make the journey, and so on. So what's there is a business model that expands over continents, not just countries. Indeed. And people are actually smugglers are advertising their services, and that model has to be broken.
Sure.
It cannot continue like that, and we should not focus just on one point of that journey, and that is Libya.
No, and I was going to, Mohamed, let me just come in there, because I was going to, Mohamed, let me just come in there. I was actually going to mention this a bit later on in the programme, but you brought it in a lot earlier. KATI, can I come to you? A lot of these migrants, according to the statistics from Amnesty International, 60% are from sub-Saharan Africa, 32% from North Africa, 7% from Asia and the Middle East. Africa is a huge continent in terms of those that come from it and those that are transversing through it. The internal issues of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, Niger, the Congo, they all have their own problems, and therefore the reasons for people migrating through, you might say, an easy route such as Libya at this present moment in time is understandable. You can't solve all of Africa's problems, and therefore it has to stop somewhere, and it's stopping on the coastline of Libya at the moment. How is this conversation being thought of to start with before you all gather and talk about it in Strasbourg?
I mean, I think here in the European Parliament, there's a wide recognition is that we keep calling all these people coming, whether they are in need of international protection or not, we keep calling them illegal migrants. But the only reason why we have to call them illegal migrants is because we don't have legal, safe pathways for refugees to enter into Europe. And this is, of course, also the problem, not only in Libya, but in many other countries. We only take in, through legal means, a very small number of people. So only those who survive and make it to the dangerous journey can actually call for international protection in Europe. So that's one thing. We need to set up that safe and legal path. But, you know, we were also faced with hundreds of people dying all on the side of the Libyan coast. This is not where the international organizations could do search and rescue missions. So is it too cynical to think that at least you're trying to train people, a Coast Guard in, I understand, a very hasty political situation in Libya, but you're trying to train them in order to save people? Now, my criticism is that we didn't put in any monitoring system there. And that's why I think an Amnesty report like this is so important, to show us about the bare facts that we have complicity with gangs, with militias in these Libyan coast guards. And that's where I think, you know, also as an EU parliamentarian, it's taxpayers' money being paid there. And we have to monitor for sure that it's not harming migrants. We should improve their situation.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here, Philip, because I think I have to. I think if you are the EU and you want to try and help, you can only help to a certain point as an elected official. And if you're helping those, for example, in Libya, the Coast Guard, various independent groups to try and either turn refugees back or get them into detention centres where they can be repatriated back to their national countries, it is a start to a certain extent of trying to find or keep people safe. It's all very well to blame the EU, isn't it, with the simple word of they're complicit to this. But they have no control on the mainland of Libya, and that's the really big problem. You have to sort the problem out there first.
What the European Union does have control of, and for instance Italy has control of, is the types of agreements that it enters into. And what we are saying, and this is very important for me, we are saying there is bad cooperation at the moment. There is cooperation at the moment that leads to additional human rights violations. Now, the alternative to bad cooperation, we're saying, is not no cooperation. We're not suggesting that the European Union or countries such as Italy bilaterally should simply walk away. And quite on the contrary, we are saying that the European Union potentially has a very important role to play. And if we take just the issue of the Libyan Coast Guard, it's absolutely right, as we've just heard a moment ago, that that efforts should be made to support the Libyan Coast Guard to rescue people at sea, particularly in waters that are Libyan territorial waters where they have a mandate to do so.
Okay.
The problem is then where the agreement allows the Libyan Coast Guard not to save those individuals and then ensure they get to safety, but then takes them back to a web of collusion whereby they are then held indefinitely and in horrendous conditions in detention centres inside Libya. And it's that that's got to change.
OK, Mohamed ElJarh, if that has got to change, at this present moment in time, where do we stand with the Libyan authorities, the civil strife that is affecting the country in terms of finding some sort of real unity government, including the military, that would allow an environment to be safe for those that want to leave the shores of Libya, if they ever did?
Currently, the country is de facto partitioned, i.e. you have two different competing authorities, one in the eastern part of the country, and then you have the internationally recognized government in the capital, Tripoli. However, that government, again, has only small or control over a small part of Western and Libya, and most of those abuses that we hear about, or we have been hearing about, are happening in areas that are no man's land. So I think a lot more should be done internationally and also regionally at making sure that we put more pressure on Libyan actors to make sure that they come to the table and that there is a settlement soon enough, so that we can create an environment conducive of uniting the state institutions, making sure that we start to have some form of security or professional military to start to develop, so that we can deal with many issues, including the migration issue, but also including the terrorism issue and a range of other issues that not only affect Libya, but affect its neighbours, the region, and also Europe.
KATI, PIRI, can I bring you in here? How important are those sub-Saharan nations and southern African nations, as well as countries such as Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq, in terms of speaking to their authorities about their own internal situations that would deter individuals from leaving their respective countries and staying in a stable, safe, happy country, rather than thinking that Europe is heaven on earth?
Well, I think, leaving aside Syria, because I think we have more serious issues there. I think in general, we need to have a long-term approach, which is effective. And one of the criticisms I have on the current approach by the European Union, suddenly our foreign policy priority seems to be stopping migrants. And this is, of course, not the way to enter into a genuine dialogue with any country, where we know that for a lot of African countries, the returns they receive for migrants who made it to Europe are much bigger than, for instance, the development money that they are getting. So we need to, when it comes to refugees, set up the legal pathways through the UNHCR so they can find a safe haven if they cannot find it in the region. But we also need to think about legal pathways for economic migrants. But I think it's also so important. When I speak to many young people in several countries in Africa, you know, for them, they say the moment we were born, it was seen as the biggest achievement to make it to Europe. And I think it's also the responsibility of all the political leaders, including in Africa, to make sure there are other ways to make it in life or to be seen as successful than just by making this very dangerous journey and sometimes having a very tough life making it here in Europe.
Philip Luther, in London, how important is that statement that KATI made about the way that, you know, sub-Saharan African countries need to really step up to the mark and look within themselves about their domestic policy when it comes to having unified nations that are not fractured? And we've seen lots of civil wars in sub-Saharan and southern Africa in recent years.
Well, it's very important, and that it very much is the bigger picture. And obviously, if you look at then the range of individuals who pass through Libya, then some are indeed economic migrants. They are ambitious, searching for a better economic future for themselves, and others are coming from war-torn countries and or indeed places where they are persecuted or at risk of serious persecution. One thinks of Eritrea, for instance, where hundreds of thousands of individuals have fled over recent years, and some have passed through Libya. So we obviously can't put everyone into the same basket. And I just, come back. Clearly, there's a question of information. So countries in sub-Saharan Africa, you need to be providing that information to their citizens. Where countries then are broken down, then clearly there are international protection concerns. And that's where I just want to come back to this issue of UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, and of the role they have in Libya, because they are hamstrung there. They don't have formal recognition. It should be an essential step that the Libyan authorities take. They need to have access to refugees and migrants to be able then to make determinations and ensure that those who do need international protection do get it. Okay. And there are some places that are too dangerous for them to go, but there are detention centres that are visited by humanitarian organisations, and it is certainly possible for them to get there.
Okay, we're coming very closely to the end of our programme. Mohamed, can I come to you? In a Europe where we're seeing countries like the Czech Republic and Hungary be very anti-migrant, where we're seeing Germany paying migrants that haven't reached the status or the vetting to have asylum being sent back to their native countries, is Europe still as attractive as a venue for those people that want to leave from Libya, and maybe not Libyan nationals, but those that you've been perhaps speaking to, aid groups, other academics that have been speaking to people on the ground that want to leave, want to find a better life? Is Europe the place to be when you have this cauldron of, you might say, hate or mistrust brewing?
I think what's important, I mentioned this point earlier, it's educating about those who are trying to make the journey, about the journey itself, about the abuses, about the dangers that they face, and also about the realities in Europe as well. And the fact that that European communities and the rise of the far right in Europe, etc., is having an effect on these countries. This is an important conversation, but this is the responsibility, I think, of African leaders, African NGOs, and international NGOs working in those countries. And I just wanted to comment on the issue of UNHCR. Despite the fact that they do not have the official recognition in Libya, I have learned recently that they have actually issued a refugee status card to 34,000 migrants in Libya. Now, who is ready to accept those 34,000 that have been issued this status by the UNHCR? Even if we do have that, it is a very sensitive issue politically, that which country is willing to accept those migrants. And there is another point. How many people will you have in detention centers in Libya? What, 20,000, 40,000? We're talking about hundreds of thousands here. Okay. Hundreds of thousands of migrants that are making this journey, and they are looking for a better life, and they need to be given an option, either back home in their countries of origin or somewhere else where they can have a better life. OK, Mohamed, thank you for that. KATI, just a very quick final statement here. Nearly 2 years ago, we saw the body of little Alan Kurdi, a 3-year-old Syrian boy, land on a Turkish beach. Those images we're going to show our viewers right now. And it went right through to Congress. John McCain in the US also talking about it on every national newspaper and media organisation. Those pictures haunt the global community. In 15 seconds, very briefly, can you tell me, do those pictures, those images still haunt you and members of the European Parliament? To me personally, yes. But I think much of the misery is now hidden from our eyes. And that's why you see less of a political debate there. If you look, the horrible journey people have to go through before reaching Libya, that is not taped on that is not coming on our news shows. That is not visible for us. But I can tell you those pictures must be just as awful as the bodies of dead people coming to our shores. OK, well, there for the moment we have to leave it. I'd like to thank all of my guests, Mohamed ElJarh, Philip Luther and KATI PIRI in Tunis, London and Strasbourg. Thank you for your time. And thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. You can watch the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is at AJ Inside Story. I'm Sohail Rahman from all of the team. Thanks very much for your time and your company. Bye-bye.